This is what we are trying to answer for today. There might be a shift in the meta of Mythic Plus based on the changes in the play rate, based on the changes on which specs are being played after not just 11.0.5 balance tuning, but also the most recent set of changes in this last reset a couple of days ago, where we can actually start to see some pretty interesting developments in the specs being played towards the high level of Mythic Plus. So that is why it might be relevant to check out what's happening this week. This was week 6 of the season, which was also week 1 of 11.0.5. So this is where we got the changes of 11.0.5 without getting this last reset's, I guess, hotfix changes. So we still had very overperforming shaman specs. We had the unbuffed warlocks and warriors, for example. Now, in the first few days of this reset, we start seeing some of the effects planned by the latest round of tuning. For example, warlocks are now doing significantly better. Warriors are now doing significantly better compared to last week, right? That was kind of the intent of these changes, right? To buff them, so that's expected. However, today, we're not even talking about how the DPS have changed from this hotfix tuning. We're talking about actually how the tanks and healers are doing, because that's where we are seeing possibly the change in the meta. Even at an eye test, just a visible surface level, what is changing in here. The ones that are more visible are the growths of Discipline Priest and then of Protection Paladin. That is definitely what stands out the most by quite a large margin, without counting the latest week, because it's only been a couple of days, so it's not really that meaningful. Even just last week, you can see the growth already of these two specs. And this is just for all high keys, right? The top Mythic Plus keys of the week. If you go to look at the actual top highest keys, the top 50 keys, top 60 keys, not even that many, you can see it even more clearly. You see that now you have basically pink and white, right? Obviously, as you start going deeper down in keys, we are still talking about super high keys and super high rating, you start seeing more brown and you start seeing more blue. So the dominance we're talking about of Paladin and Priest, and in particular Paladin, is only in the very highest of keys. It's practically in like 3 to 4 teams running the comp right now. You have a Chinese team running with this comp, you have Yoda's team running with this comp, and then you have Growl's team with Dorky running with this comp. That's just 3 groups, basically, that have started running this comp right now. Even if you look at the overall keys over here, you see Protection Warrior being ahead of Paladin. If you start looking at keys over 12, is still Warrior, over 13 is still Warrior, over 14 they get even, and then over 15 Prot Paladin goes ahead of Protection Warrior. Same treatment for healers, it's even more lopsided when you start. Resto Shaman is at 70%, they are still ahead at 13, they are still ahead at 14, and they are still ahead at 15. So the advantage and the growth of Prot Paladin is way more visible than the one of a Discipline Priest. We already saw it right here as well, that it was more visible, and you could see it even here. Even here in the super top keys, you still had shamans, you still had multiple groups running shaman, and as you kept going down, the blue became more and more visible, even paired still with Protection Paladin, not necessarily just with Warrior. Because that's the question right now, the composition of which tank is running with which healer, and as a result of the tank and healer you're running, which DPS you are choosing. Well, unfortunately, we have to say a couple of the DPS have not been changing. So we're talking about Augmentation and we're talking about DK. DK can be Unholy, DK can be Frost, it doesn't really matter, it's still the same class, and same goes for Augmentation. One of the biggest divides, one of the biggest changes has been the playing versus not playing a shaman as a DPS. And generally what is going to take place of a shaman DPS, if it's not being played, is going to be a mage as a replacement. Now, at the moment, you have this awkward situation where we have one of the things we said it doesn't happen very often, which is running 2 specs of the same class together. Because at the moment we seem to have the healer shaman to be equally as powerful as the DPS shaman, so much so that many groups are running both of them at the same time, right? Even if it's not a common thing normally, enhancement and restoration at the moment, for example, are being run very often by different groups, different names in different groups, in different high keys. They're still being run together. That is at the moment the exception we are seeing. Now, obviously, running a priest over running your Resto Shaman allows you, of course, to get more things, because a Resto Shaman gives you the same things an Enhancement Shaman can give you in terms of utility, in terms of buffs, and you don't have a priest. If you bring a priest, then you have stamina buff, you have power infusion. In the case of running with a tank, Discipline Priest has a very powerful external cooldown they can give to Protection Paladin, which is possibly the only one weakness a Resto Shaman might have right now in the season, the fact that they don't have a proper, real and true external to give to a tank, which is less necessary for a tank as tanky as a Protection Warrior, but is definitely more useful if you're running with a Protection Paladin. Now the question would be though, why would you be running with a Protection Paladin? Why exactly are you even rising this much? What happened? Well, what happened was 11.0.5 did buff Protection Paladin by a lot. Now, there was a question of whether or not the general talent tree changes were even going to be a buff to begin with to the Paladin specs as a whole. It seems that most Paladins were in agreement this is at best a side grade, or it's up to opinion on whether or not this was positive. So what definitely turned this into a positive change for Protection Paladin was what happened to their spec changes, which were a whole bunch of buff. You had more damage, you had more healing, you had more base armor and more armor given by Shield of the Righteous, more damage of Shield of the Righteous, you had your cooldown reduction you lost from the general tree, to you it was given back on a bunch of abilities by your buffs. You had 1 free point by turning Gift of the Valkyrie into a 1-cost ability. You had massive damage boost with this new talent, Refining Fire. And all of this gave Prot Paladin now something quite unique compared to other tanks, which is their massive damage. That is one of the unique things now a Prot Paladin is bringing. Now, you might be asking yourself, but, yeah, it's ahead, it's number 1, but it's not, gapping the tanks by that much. It's like 80,000, it's like 14% more damage. Yes, but you're forgetting that Brewmaster Monk is second in terms of damage. And if you look at the meta, Brewmaster Monk is here. So, Prot Paladin isn't competing with doing more damage with Brewmaster Monk or Vengeance. It's competing with Prot Warrior and before this last week with Guardian Druid. Those were the other two tanks being played the most. So, when you compare the damage of a Prot Paladin with a Prot Warrior and the Guardian Druid, they are in the realm of 30+% ahead in terms of the damage they are doing. This is even more visible when you switch over to tanks and tank damage in top level Mythic class keys. Right off the bat, again, the eye test, Prot Warrior, I'm assuming he knows what he's doing because he's running a 17 Arakara and he's doing 923,000, and both of the Paladins are doing 400,000 damage more than him. That is practically 40% more damage than the Warrior. If you keep scrolling down to different keys, you have similar gaps, 970 to 700 something. It's, 200,000 plus damage, which is 30% more damage than a Prot Warrior, and it keeps going, showing visible gaps between the damage of a Prot Paladin and the damage of a Prot Warrior. That is the major advantage, and also given to them, of course, by what we mentioned, given to them by 11.0.5, Refining Fire, which is part of Avenger's Shield. It's practically a single talent giving you 10% more damage because of the dot you leave behind after every Avenger's Shield, as well as also helped by the buffed damage of Shield of the Righteous as well. So that is now the niche of the Protection Paladin, the fact that they do have by far the most damage out of any of the tanks, at least any of the tanks competing with them for being top tier in high keys. So they have by far the most damage. Now, one thing Paladin always had, even when they weren't meta, which is the same reasoning and the same explanation many players give whenever players were complaining about the utility of Resto Shaman, which was Resto Shaman always had this utility. Even when Resto Shaman for many seasons and many years wasn't being played, they still had the things you only now start to complain about just because they are meta. It is more or less the same logic for a Protection Paladin, right? For example, in this key, a Mist of Tyrnaseed key, you can see that despite the quite high HPS of the Protection Paladin, they only heal themselves for 86% of their healing, because 15% of this, which is almost 100,000 HPS, is going to the rest of the group, especially as you are playing Lightsmith, so you have buffs like Holy Bulwark, you have buffs like Tempered in Battle that are going to the rest of your party. They still have something players mentioned before the season even began, as if this could have been a very powerful tool for Prot Paladin when players realized about the crowd control changes, the fact that now stunning, disorienting and whatever didn't actually send the cast of the mobs on cooldown, and you needed to actually interrupt the enemies. Well, of course, if you are talking about interrupts, then amongst the tanks, the one that can easily win overall in terms of total amount of interrupts, the one that can win the easiest is of course Protection Paladin with Avenger's Shield, on top of their already normal interrupt. So they can bring very high damage, they still have very good utility, they still have very good interrupts, which are good in this season, which is what has made them, for now, rise by quite a lot in the popularity in this first week and the beginning of this second week of 11.0.5. Now, the other question would be, okay, but what about discipline though? What's the logic there? Because in 11.0.5, sure, fine, we concede that Protection Paladin has been buffed, but Discipline Priest wasn't even in the mentions. Discipline Priest wasn't even there. So absolutely nothing happened to Discipline Priest. And this was already when Discipline Priest started rising, right? This was already doubling, more than doubling the representation of Disc without any buffs. Yes, they have actually, and that's why it was interesting, they've actually been buffed the week after, because the week after, 2 days ago, Discipline Priest was buffed in the non-atonement healing, so the initial heal of Radiance as well as Flesh Heal were buffed by a bit. It's not too relevant of a buff if you go to look at the Discipline Priest itself and look at the healing done, you know, Flesh Heal being buffed by 15%, the initial heal of Powered Radiance buffed by 20%, you know, this is like a 3% heal increase. It's not that relevant in terms of what they will do for healing, which will be atonement healing, right? Now, one of the powerful things of a Discipline Priest is, of course, and it might seem weird, but it is the fact that it is not another shaman, as we mentioned. Just the fact that you're a priest on the basis of being a priest and not being a double up shaman on the same group, because almost all of the things the rest of shaman is bringing are already brought by the enhancement shaman, minus, say, you know, Spirit Link, for example. Besides that, you bring an extra stamina, you bring an extra power infusion, you bring an extra very powerful external for the tank. Your absolutely one major weakness, which you still have after this many years, which is no interrupt, is being covered by you having a paladin with you, with Avenger Shield practically covering your own lack of interrupt. And although not nearly as relevant, but you also do have massive amount of extra damage compared to the other healers. Same treatment we have mentioned for Protection Paladin, same is for Discipline. Again, you might be saying, but actually Mistweaver is very close, you know, actually even Preservation Evoker, the top runs of Preservation Evoker are doing very well. It doesn't matter, because they are here, right? So they are competing with Resto Shaman, not with all of these healers, right? So when you look at Resto Shaman, then the average Discipline Priest is about 120,000 DPS ahead of Resto Shaman, which is 60%. Discipline Priest does 60% more damage than a Resto Shaman. So that is the advantage of Discipline over Shaman, just like Protection Paladin over Protection Warrior. Now, before we mention anything, yes, there is a caveat. In this tuning, what was also buffed significantly was the damage of Farseer for restoration, especially Chain Lightning. This means that quite comfortably, if the builds of Resto Shaman keep rising for Farseer in Mythic Plus, they will be able to have equal, if not above, damage of Discipline Priest while playing Farseer at the moment, simply due to how much damage can they do with Chain Lightning right now as you play Farseer. But this is hinging more on the power of Prot Paladin and Discipline Priest sort of following suit. As we have seen here already, it's not that Prot Paladin is being exclusively paired with Discipline Priest, it's still just running fine with Resto Shaman as well. It's more like it's Paladin first and then maybe eventually after Discipline Priest as well. It's many of the buffs given to Protection Paladin still being able to pull off things like, you know, the massive pulls around their immunity with Divine Shield. Unseen things, like for example, if you're running a Prot Paladin, you have 3% DR because of Devotion Aura, and if you're running Discipline Priest in Mythic Plus, you're running with Lenience, which is 3% damage reduction from Atonement, which is practically up all the time. So it's a 6% damage reduction you can bring to your entire party if you're running both of these specs together. Yes, technically they do have more visible things compared to other specs, because for example, the buffs they can give out or the damage increase they get from Lightsmith is counted as their damage, whereas for example, a Prot Warrior's Battle Shout isn't counted as part of a Prot Warrior's damage. So whenever you look at a key like this with a Prot Warrior and an Enhancement Shaman and a Frost DK, a percentage of their damage is technically the Prot Warriors, because that's Battle Shout. However, this won't really show up in this number right here. Just like the 3% damage reduction of Protection Paladin won't show up in the Healing Dawn of Protection Paladin. And to finish, what this is bringing is of course more value to the DPS Shaman. This is something we have mentioned ever since we started looking at this. And we were like, well, you know what, they are still doing quite well because they are doing very good damage, you know, even in the very first weeks as we were looking at this, you know, they were good. You know, week 3, they were good. Week 4, they were good. Week 5, they were good. 11.0.5 launches, they are insane. Now they get nerfed and they are still good. So the question wasn't, are they good enough to be in a group? The question wasn't, what's gonna happen with this if they continue to be good? Are you just going to run double Shaman in your group? It was the same question we had at the start when we looked at Blood and Frost. We were like, okay, but it's unlikely you're gonna be playing both, right? And eventually the answer was, you're not running Blood, you're running Frost, right? That was the winner. Frost was the winner. Nobody thought of running Blood and Frost. However, for Shamans, it was more of a question mark. It continues to be more of a question mark, where it's perfectly common to now see double Shaman runs. Even now with Paladin and Priest, being able to run Paladin and Shaman with another Shaman is still a plenty common thing. So we will see, of course, as this continues down this week, together with getting closer to the MDI. So possibly many of these groups are starting to get ready to prepare a possible perfect comp for that tournament, how things are going to shape up in terms of the meta, in terms of the perfect comp going higher and higher in keys. Because in the past couple of weeks we haven't risen that much in terms of keys, in terms of key level, but after the nerfs to Mythic Plus coming this week, it will likely get even higher. We will continue to see how this will shape up, especially in the tank department as well as in the healer department in Mythic Plus. But for today, though, on this Thursday, we can now take a break and then just observe the changes coming down in the meta of Mythic Plus. So with this out of the way, we can now leave each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, for having watched the video, together with, of course, supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, this was way longer than it had any reason to. I could have done this in 12 minutes.